October 2019, Marine Corps Base Camp Pendleton, California, when three young Marines spotted the old man's faded, rust-covered dog tags at the commissary checkout line. Their laughter echoed through the store, until a four-star general walking behind them suddenly froze, his face going pale as he read the name etched on that worn metal. Within seconds, every service member in that building was standing at attention, and the joke died in their throats. What could possibly be on those dog tags that would make one of the military's highest-ranking officers snap to attention for a man who looked like he hadn't worn a uniform in decades? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The fluorescent lights of the Camp Pendleton commissary buzzed overhead as Saturday afternoon shoppers moved through the aisles. Staff Sergeant Marcus Webb stood in the checkout line with his two buddies, Corporal Jake Hartley and Lance Corporal Devon Mitchell, all three fresh off a brutal training exercise and still riding the high of having survived another week of relentless drills. They were young, fit and proud, the kind of Marines who wore their service like armor, convinced they understood what sacrifice meant because they'd endured sleepless nights and push-ups in the rain. That's when the old man shuffled into line behind them. He had to be in his late 80s, maybe older. His weathered hands trembled slightly as he placed a single bag of coffee and a newspaper on the conveyor belt. He wore a faded flannel shirt that had seen better days, work boots scuffed beyond recognition, and a canvas jacket that hung loose on his thin frame. But what caught Marcus's attention were the dog tags hanging outside his shirt, dull, rust-eaten metal that looked like they'd been pulled from a junkyard. "Check that out," Marcus muttered to Jake, nodding toward the old man. "Looks like someone's grandfather found those at a garage sale." Jake snorted, trying to suppress a grin. "Those tags are so corroded you probably can't even read the name anymore. Wonder if he actually served or just likes the look." Devon, the youngest of the three at 22, couldn't resist adding his commentary. "My tags are stainless steel, man. Those things look like they've been through a garbage disposal. Who even wears tags that beat up?" Their voices carried more than they realized. A few other shoppers glanced over, some with disapproval, others simply uncomfortable with the conversation. The old man, however, didn't seem to notice. Or perhaps he'd simply learned long ago not to react to such things. He stood quietly, his rheumy eyes focused somewhere distant, as if he were looking at something only he could see. Marcus paid for his energy drinks and protein bars, still chuckling as he stepped aside. "I mean, I respect veterans and all, but come on. If you're going to wear the tags, at least keep them clean. That's just disrespectful to the uniform." "Maybe he doesn't remember he's wearing them," Jake suggested, grabbing his bag. "My grandpa had dementia. Started wearing his old Navy cap everywhere, even to bed." Probably the same situation. The three Marines lingered near the exit, waiting for their buddy, who was still browsing the magazine rack. They didn't notice when the automatic doors slid open behind them. Didn't register the sudden change in atmosphere as other shoppers began to straighten up, their casual Saturday afternoon posture shifting into something more rigid. What they did notice was the voice. Calm, measured, and carrying the unmistakable weight of command. Staff Sergeant Webb. Marcus turned, and his blood turned to ice water. General Richard Blackwood stood 3 feet away, his 4 stars gleaming on his shoulder boards, even though he wore civilian clothes, khaki pants, and a simple polo shirt. But rank doesn't need a uniform to be recognized, and every Marine within eyeshot suddenly understood that someone important had entered the building. "Sir!" Marcus snapped to attention so fast he nearly dropped his bag. Jake and Devon followed a split second later, their faces draining of color. The general wasn't looking at them. His eyes were locked on the old man at the checkout counter, who was now fumbling with his wallet, trying to count out exact change with fingers that didn't quite cooperate anymore. The cashier, a patient middle-aged woman, smiled and told him to take his time. General Blackwood walked past the 3 frozen Marines without another word. He moved through the commissary with purpose, his stride that of a man who'd spent 50 years in service and knew exactly how to carry himself. Other shoppers parted instinctively, sensing something significant was happening, even if they didn't understand what. He stopped directly behind the old man. "Sir," the general said quietly, his voice thick with an emotion Marcus couldn't quite identify. "May I see your tags?" The old man turned slowly, confusion flickering across his weathered face. Up close, Marcus could see the deep lines carved into his skin, the age spots on his hands, the way his shoulders curved inward, as if carrying an invisible weight. This was someone who'd lived a long, hard life. "My tags," the old man repeated, his voice raspy. "These old things? They're just mine. Had them since I was 19. May I?" The general repeated. And this time it wasn't a question, but a request filled with profound respect. The old man lifted the chain over his head with shaking hands and passed the tags to General Blackwood. The rust was even more apparent up close, reddish-brown corrosion covering most of the stamped metal, the edges rough and pitted. But the general held them as if they were made of gold, his fingers tracing the barely legible letters. Marcus watched as the general's jaw tightened, his eyes widening slightly. Whatever he was reading on those tags had hit him like a physical blow. The general's voice, when he spoke again, carried through the entire checkout area. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his command voice filling the space, "we are in the presence of a Congressional Medal of Honor recipient." The effect was instantaneous. Every person in military service, and there were at least a dozen in the commissary that afternoon, snapped to attention. Civilians stopped mid-motion, shopping bags hanging forgotten in their hands. The casual Saturday atmosphere evaporated, replaced by something reverent and electric. Marcus felt his stomach drop through the floor. Medal of Honor, the highest military decoration, awarded for valor above and beyond the call of duty. Only 3,500 had been awarded in the entire history of the United States military, and he'd just mocked the man who wore one. The old man looked confused, almost embarrassed by the sudden attention. "Oh, that was a long time ago," he mumbled. "Different war, different world. It doesn't matter how long ago it was," General Blackwood said firmly. He came to full attention, his heels clicking together, and rendered the sharpest salute Marcus had ever seen. "Thank you for your service, sir. It is an honor to stand in your presence." The old man's eyes grew wet. His trembling hand came up slowly, returning the salute with the muscle memory of someone who'd done it 10,000 times before. For just a moment, Marcus could see past the aged exterior to the young warrior who'd once been, the soldier who'd faced something terrible and survived. Marcus's throat constricted. His energy drinks suddenly felt heavy in his hands, trivial and stupid. Beside him, Jake had gone pale, and Devon looked like he might be sick. What had this man done? What battle had forged those rusty tags? And more importantly, what right did 3 arrogant Marines have to judge a hero they couldn't begin to understand? General Blackwood carefully handed the dog tags back to the old man, treating them with the reverence one might show a sacred relic. The commissary had fallen into complete silence. Even the checkout scanner had stopped beeping. The cashier standing frozen with her hand hovering over the register. "Forgive me." "Sir," the general said, his voice quieter now but still carrying authority, "I didn't catch your name when I read the tags." The corrosion made some letters difficult to make out. The old man slipped the chain back over his head, tucking the tags beneath his flannel shirt as if trying to hide them away again. Henry Dalton, but most folks just call me Hank." "Mr. Dalton," the general continued, "would you allow me to pay for your groceries today?" "It would be my privilege." Hank waved him off with an embarrassed shake of his head. "No need for that, son. I can manage. Got my pension and my Social Security. I do just fine." But the general was already handing his credit card to the stunned cashier. "Please, I insist." Marcus watched this exchange from his position near the exit, still standing at rigid attention, even though the general hadn't directly ordered it. His mind raced, trying to process what was happening. He'd spent the last 5 years in the Marines, had deployed twice, had earned his stripes through sweat and determination. He thought he understood what service meant. Clearly, he'd understood nothing. A retired colonel who'd been shopping for his wife's birthday cake approached slowly, his grey hair and weathered face marking him as someone from an earlier generation. He stopped a respectful distance from Hank and came to attention as well. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Sir, I just want to say, it's an honor. My father served in Korea. He used to tell me stories about men like you. I never thought I'd actually meet one. Hank looked uncomfortable with the attention, his shoulders hunching further. Like I said, it was a long time ago. I was just doing my job, same as everyone else who wore the uniform. No, sir, the colonel said gently. Not the same. Never the same. More people were gathering now, not crowding, but forming a respectful semicircle around Hank. An elderly woman with tears in her eyes, a young army specialist who couldn't have been more than 20, a Navy chief with 30 years of ribbons on his chest, all of them standing in silent tribute to a man who looked like he wanted nothing more than to finish buying his coffee and go home. General Blackwood seemed to sense Hank's discomfort. He collected the grocery bag and handed it to the old man. Mr. Dalton, I wonder if you might spare a few minutes of your time. There are some young Marines here who I believe could benefit from hearing your story. Hank's eyes, still sharp despite their cloudiness, shifted to where Marcus and his friends stood. Recognition flickered across his face, not angry recognition, but the sad, knowing look of someone who'd seen this particular scene play out before. The boys by the door? Hank asked. The ones who were laughing? Marcus wanted to disappear into the floor. Wanted to run, wanted to be anywhere but under the gaze of this man and this general. Yes, sir, General Blackwood confirmed, his tone carefully neutral. Those Marines. Hank studied them for a long moment, and Marcus forced himself not to look away, even though shame burned through him like acid. Finally, the old man nodded. All right, but not here. Too many folks staring already. There's a bench outside by the memorial garden. We can talk there. The general gestured toward Marcus and his friends. Staff Sergeant Webb, you and your men will accompany us. Now, yes, sir, Marcus barked, grateful to finally have a clear order to follow. They moved through the commissary in a strange procession, the general leading, Hank shuffling behind with his single grocery bag, and 3 Marines following at a respectful distance. Other shoppers parted to let them pass, many offering small nods of respect toward Hank, who seemed to shrink further into himself with each acknowledgement. Outside, the California sun beat down mercilessly, but the memorial garden offered some shade beneath its carefully maintained oak trees. Bronze plaques lined the walkway, each commemorating Marines who'd given their lives in service. Hank lowered himself onto a concrete bench with a grunt, settling his grocery bag beside him. General Blackwood remained standing, his posture perfect despite the heat. Marcus and his friends stood at attention 5 feet away, sweating in their civilian clothes, afraid to move or speak. Mr. Dalton, the general began, these Marines were discussing your dog tags before I arrived. I believe they found the condition of your tags amusing. Marcus's face burned hotter than the sun above them. Beside him, Jake's jaw clenched, and Devon stared at his shoes. Hank looked at them with those knowing eyes. You boys think these tags are in bad shape. Sir, we... Marcus started, but Hank held up a weathered hand. It's all right, son. They do look rough. I'll grant you that. He pulled the tags out from beneath his shirt again, holding them up to the light. The rust was even more apparent in the direct sunlight. Deep pitting on the metal, edges worn smooth, letters barely visible. Got these in 1951, basic training at Paris Island. I was 19 years old and thought I was invincible. He paused, his thumb rubbing across the corroded surface. They sent us to Korea 6 months later, December of '51. Coldest winter I ever experienced. Temperatures dropped to 30 below zero. We were fighting the Chinese army at the Chosin Reservoir. Marcus had heard of the Chosin Reservoir. Every Marine had. It was one of the bloodiest battles in Corps history. 17 days of brutal combat in Arctic conditions against overwhelming enemy forces. The Marines called it the Frozen Chosin. My platoon got cut off from the main force, Hank continued, his voice taking on a distant quality, as if he were watching the memories play out before him. 32 of us trapped on a hilltop with Chinese forces surrounding us on 3 sides. We were supposed to hold that position until reinforcements arrived. They gave us 2 days' worth of ammunition and told us to make it count. The old man's hands had stopped trembling. They gripped the dog tags tightly now, knuckles white against the aged skin. The first assault came at dawn on the second day. They outnumbered us 20 to 1, maybe more. We held them off, but it cost us. Lost 11 men in the first hour. His voice cracked slightly. Boys I'd trained with, friends, brothers. General Blackwood stood motionless, his expression grave. Marcus felt his throat constricting, his earlier shame evolving into something deeper, a profound awareness of his own ignorance. The second assault came at nightfall. We were down to 18 men by then, and our ammunition was running low. That's when our commanding officer, Lieutenant Reynolds, got hit by mortar fire. He died asking me to take care of his men. Hank looked down at his tags, at the rust that covered them. This rust? This isn't from age, boys. It's from blood. My blood, the blood of my brothers, enemy blood. These tags spent 3 days frozen to my chest while we fought. When they finally evacuated us, a Navy corpsman had to thaw them free with warm water. The metal was so cold it had bonded to my skin. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the birds seemed to have stopped singing. We lost 28 men on that hilltop, Hank said quietly. Only 4 of us made it out. I was awarded the Medal of Honor because I stayed behind to cover. The retreat took out an enemy machine gun nest that was tearing us apart. But the real heroes, they're still on that frozen hill in Korea. They never came home. He tucked the tags back beneath his shirt, and Marcus finally understood. Those rust-covered pieces of metal weren't neglected or disrespected. They were honored. They were remembered. They carried the weight of 28 ghosts and a war most people had forgotten. So when you see an old veteran with beat-up tags, Hank said, looking directly at Marcus, maybe ask yourself what those tags have been through before you decide they're not worth respecting. Marcus's vision blurred. He blinked rapidly, mortified to find tears threatening to fall. What had he done? The memorial garden felt smaller now, as if Hank's words had compressed the very air around them. Marcus could hear his own heartbeat pounding. In his ears, could feel the sweat trickling down his spine that had nothing to do with the California heat. He'd never felt smaller in his entire life, and he'd endured every humiliation the Marine Corps could throw at a recruit during boot camp. General Blackwood broke the silence, his voice carrying a weight that commanded attention without being loud. Mr. Dalton's actions on that hilltop saved 43 Marines in the companies behind his position. The Chinese forces were attempting to overrun the entire defensive line. By holding that ground and eliminating the machine gun nest, he gave our forces time to establish a proper defensive perimeter. The official citation estimates his actions saved hundreds of American lives. Hank shook his head slowly. The citation says a lot of things, makes it sound heroic, but when you're in it, when you're watching your friends die around you, there's nothing heroic about it. You just do what needs doing, because the alternative is letting more people die. Jake finally found his voice, though it came out hoarse and uncertain. Sir, how did you take out the machine gun nest? For a moment, Marcus thought Hank wouldn't answer. The old man stared at the bronze plaques across from the bench, his jaw working as if chewing on words he didn't want to speak. When he finally responded, his voice had gone flat, emotionless, the tone of someone recounting events too painful to feel. Our grenades were frozen solid, wouldn't arm properly in that cold. So I loaded up with what ammunition we had left and crawled through the snow. It took me 40 minutes to cover maybe 200 yards. The Chinese were focused on the main position, didn't see me coming from the flank. He paused, his hands gripping his knees. I got within 20 feet of their position and opened fire, killed 6 men before they knew what hit them. The rest scattered, but their machine gun was destroyed. That's enough time for the evacuation. Devon, who hadn't spoken since the general arrived, asked the question that had been growing in Marcus's mind. "Did you get wounded, sir? You mentioned your blood on the tags." "Shrapnel from a Chinese grenade," Hank replied, touching his left shoulder unconsciously. "Tore through my jacket and laid me open pretty good. I made it back to our position, but I passed out from blood loss. Woke up 2 days later in a field hospital in Hungnam. They told me I'd almost died 3 times during the evacuation." General. Blackwood added context that Hank seemed reluctant to provide. Mr. Dalton was unconscious when they awarded him the Medal of Honor at the field hospital. He spent 6 months recovering from his wounds before being medically discharged. He was 20 years old. 20 years old. Marcus was 27. He'd thought he was experienced, seasoned, a professional warrior who understood sacrifice. But at 20, Hank Dalton had faced death on a frozen hilltop and saved hundreds of lives. At 27, Marcus had just mocked him for wearing rusty dog tags. The realization hit him like a physical blow, and suddenly Marcus couldn't hold it in anymore. He broke attention, a breach of protocol that would normally earn him a savage reprimand, and stepped forward, dropping to one knee in front of Hank. "Sir, I have no excuse. What we said, there's no justification for it. We were arrogant and ignorant and disrespectful, and I'm sorry. I'm so deeply sorry." His voice cracked on the last word, and he didn't care. Let his friends see him break. Let the general see it. This moment demanded nothing less than complete honesty. Hank's weathered hand came to rest on Marcus's shoulder, the grip surprisingly strong for such an old man. "Son, look at me!" Marcus raised his eyes, blinking away the moisture that blurred his vision. "You made a mistake," Hank said simply. "We all make mistakes." The measure of a man isn't whether he stumbles, it's whether he gets back up and learns from it. You think I've never said something stupid? Never judged someone unfairly? I'm 87 years old, and I'm still learning that lesson. But, sir, you're a hero. You saved lives. I'm a man who did his duty on one day 70 years ago," Hank interrupted gently. "That doesn't make me better than anyone else. It just makes me someone who survived when too many others didn't. The real heroes are the ones who never came home to receive apologies or gratitude or anything else." Jake and Devon had moved closer, both of them fighting their own battles with shame and remorse. Jake spoke next, his voice thick. "How do we make this right, sir? What can we possibly do?" Hank considered the question, his eyes moving from one young Marine to another. "You want to make it right? Then remember this feeling. Remember what it's like to judge someone without knowing their story. And the next time you see an old veteran, at the commissary, at the gas station, anywhere, take a moment to thank them. Not because they're heroes, but because they served. Because they put on the uniform when their country asked, just like you're doing now." He shifted his gaze to Marcus specifically. "And when you're the one training the next generation of Marines, you teach them this lesson. You make sure they understand that every veteran, every person who wore these tags, has a story. Some of those stories are written in blood on frozen hillsides. Others are quieter but no less important. Either way, they deserve respect." General Blackwood, who had remained silent during this exchange, finally spoke. "Mr. Dalton is correct. Staff Sergeant Webb, you and your men will spend the next 3 Saturdays volunteering at the Veterans Affairs Hospital in La Jolla. You'll talk to the veterans there. You'll listen to their stories. You'll learn what service really means beyond the training exercises and the deployments." "Yes, sir," Marcus responded immediately, getting to his feet. "Thank you, sir." "Don't thank me," the general said sharply. "Thank Mr. Dalton for being gracious enough to educate you instead of letting me handle this through official channels. Because make no mistake, what you did today could have ended your careers. Mocking a Medal of Honor recipient, even unknowingly, is not something the Corps takes lightly. The three Marines snapped back to attention, the full weight of their actions finally crystallizing. They could have been court-martialed, could have been dishonorably discharged, could have lost everything they'd worked for over a moment of thoughtless arrogance. Hank struggled to his feet, waving off the general's offer of assistance. He picked up his grocery bag, the simple act somehow dignified despite his trembling hands. "I should get home. My daughter worries if I'm gone too long. Allow me to give you a ride, sir," General Blackwood offered. "No need. I drove here myself. Still got my license, still got my old truck. Independence is important when you get to my age." As Hank turned to leave, he paused and looked back at the three Marines. "You boys are good men. I can see it. You made a mistake today, but you owned it. That takes courage, too. Different kind of courage than what we needed in Korea, but courage nonetheless. Don't let this moment define you. Let it refine you." He shuffled away, moving slowly through the memorial garden with his single bag of groceries, just an old man in worn clothes and rusty dog tags. But Marcus would never see him that way again. None of them would. General Blackwood watched until Hank disappeared around the corner, then turned his full attention to the three Marines. His expression was granite hard now. The brief moment of grace that had allowed them to learn from Hank was over. "My office. Monday morning, 600 hours. All three of you will discuss your volunteer assignment in detail, and I'll be checking in personally to ensure you complete it with the respect and dedication it deserves. Dismissed." "Yes, sir," they chorused, saluting sharply. As the general walked away, Marcus stood in the memorial garden with Jake and Devon, all three of them processing what had just happened. The bronze plaques seemed to glow in the afternoon sun, each name a story, each story a lesson they'd never bothered to learn, until today. The following Saturday morning arrived with the kind of crisp brightness that California does best. But Marcus barely noticed the weather as he pulled into the parking lot of the Veterans Affairs Hospital in La Jolla. Jake's truck pulled in beside him 2 minutes later, and Devon arrived on his motorcycle shortly after. None of them had spoken much since Monday's meeting in General Blackwood's office, where they'd received detailed instructions about their volunteer assignment, along with a lecture that had stripped away any remaining pride they'd been clinging to. The hospital was a sprawling complex of beige buildings, palm trees swaying in the morning breeze as if everything was peaceful and normal. Marcus knew better now. Behind those walls were men and women who'd sacrificed in ways he was only beginning to understand. They met at the entrance, all three wearing civilian clothes as instructed, jeans and plain t-shirts, nothing that screamed military. The general had been explicit. This wasn't about them showing off their service. This was about listening. "Ready?" Jake asked, though his face suggested he was anything but. "Does it matter?" Devon replied, pushing through the glass doors. The reception desk was staffed by a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a volunteer badge that read, "Susan." She smiled when she saw them approach. "You must be the Marines that General Blackwood called about. Welcome, I'm Susan Kowalski, the volunteer coordinator." "Yes, ma'am," Marcus responded. Staff Sergeant Marcus Webb, Corporal Jake Hartley, and Lance Corporal Devon Mitchell, reporting as instructed. Susan's smile didn't waver, but something in her eyes suggested she knew exactly why they were here. "The general explained your assignment. You'll be spending time with veterans in our long-term care ward. Many of them don't get regular visitors. Your job is simple. Sit with them, talk to them, and most importantly, listen to them." She led them through a maze of corridors that smelled of disinfectant and something else Marcus couldn't quite identify. Maybe age, maybe resignation, maybe just the weight of accumulated memories. The walls were decorated with patriotic artwork and photographs from various wars. Black and white images of young men who looked impossibly brave and impossibly young. The long-term care ward was quieter than Marcus expected. Private rooms lined both sides of a wide hallway, most doors standing open to reveal elderly men in various states of awareness. Some watched television, Others stared out windows, and a few simply slept in their beds, their breathing shallow and labored. "We have 43 veterans in this ward," Susan explained, her voice softer now. "World War II, Korea, Vietnam, and a few from the Gulf War. Some have family who visit regularly, others—" She trailed off. The unfinished sentence speaking volumes. She stopped at the first room on the left. "This is Thomas Reed. He's 94, served in the Pacific during World War II. He loves talking about baseball, especially the Brooklyn Dodgers. His memory comes and goes, but he has good days and bad days." Through the doorway, Marcus could see a frail man propped up in bed, his white hair neatly combed, wearing striped pajamas that hung loose on his thin frame. His eyes tracked their movement, and a smile creased his weathered face. "Visitors," Thomas called out, his voice surprisingly strong. Come in, come in! Don't just stand there like strangers." Marcus exchanged glances with Jake and Devon, then stepped into the room. Up close, he could see the tremor in Thomas's hands, the slight cloudiness in his eyes, the way his skin seemed paper-thin and translucent. But his smile was genuine, warm, inviting. "Good morning, sir," Marcus said, unsure of the proper protocol. "My name is Marcus. These are my friends Jake and Devon. We're Marines stationed at Camp Pendleton. Marines." Thomas's face lit up even brighter. "I fought alongside some Marines at Iwo Jima, tough sons of guns, every one of them. Saved my bacon more than once. Sit down, sit down. Don't hover like nervous pigeons." There were 3 chairs arranged near the bed, and they settled into them awkwardly. Marcus had faced enemy fire with more composure than he felt in this quiet hospital room. "Iwo Jima," Jake said. "That must have been intense." Thomas's smile faded slightly, his eyes taking on that distant quality Marcus had seen in Hank Dalton's gaze. "Intense. That's one word for it. 36 days of hell is another. I was Army, attached to the 3rd Marine Division as a medic. Landed on the beach the 2nd day." His trembling hand reached for a water glass on the bedside table, and Marcus quickly grabbed it, helping him take a sip. Thomas nodded his thanks and continued. "The black sand was the first thing I noticed. Volcanic ash, really. It was everywhere, in your boots, your clothes, your lungs, and the smell. Burning metal, sulfur from the volcano, and—" He paused, swallowing hard. "Other things you don't forget." Devon leaned forward, his earlier discomfort giving way to genuine interest. "What was your job as a medic?" "My job was keeping boys alive long enough to get them off that island," Thomas said simply. "Most of the time I failed. The Japanese had fortified that place like nothing we'd ever seen. Tunnels, bunkers, hidden artillery positions. They could hit us from anywhere and we couldn't see them. I'd be treating one wounded Marine when another would get hit right next to me. Sometimes 3 or 4 at once." The room fell silent, except for the quiet beeping of a monitor somewhere down the hall. Marcus found himself holding his breath, afraid to interrupt. "There was this one kid," Thomas continued, his voice dropping to barely a whisper. "Private First Class Danny Sullivan from Boston. Couldn't have been more than 18. Took shrapnel to the chest during an artillery barrage. I worked on him for 20 minutes, trying everything I knew, but the damage was too severe. He kept asking me if his mother would be proud of him. Kept saying he hoped he'd done enough." A single tear tracked down Thomas's weathered cheek. "I told him yes. Told him he was a hero. Told him his mother would be so proud. He smiled at that and then he was gone. I think about Danny Sullivan every single day. 79 years later, and I still wonder if I could have done more." Marcus felt his throat constrict. Here was another man carrying ghosts, another veteran bearing the weight of brothers who never came home. "Different war, different beach, same grief. I'm sure you did everything you could, sir," Marcus managed. "You saved lives that day?" "Maybe," Thomas acknowledged. "The official records say I treated over 100 wounded men on Iwo Jima. They gave me a Bronze Star for it. But I don't think about the ones I saved. I think about the ones I couldn't. Does that make sense?" It made perfect sense. Marcus was beginning to understand that this was the burden every veteran carried. Not pride in their achievements, but sorrow for what they'd lost, for who they couldn't save, for the price of survival. Susan appeared in the doorway, her expression gentle. "Thomas needs to rest before lunch. Why don't you gentlemen move on to the next room? Thomas reached out with that trembling hand, and Marcus took it carefully. The old man's grip was weak but determined. Come back and see me again, Thomas said. It's nice having young people to talk to. Makes me remember what it felt like to be strong. We will, sir, Marcus promised. Absolutely. They filed out into the hallway, and Marcus had to pause for a moment, collecting himself. One conversation, one veteran, and he already felt emotionally drained. They had an entire ward to visit. Susan led them to the next room. This is Carlton Price, Vietnam veteran Marine Corps. He's 76 and dealing with complications from Agent Orange exposure. He's also blind, lost his sight 15 years ago. He might seem gruff at first, but don't let that fool you. The man in the next bed sat upright in a wheelchair positioned by the window, even though he couldn't see the view. He wore a faded Marine Corps t-shirt, and his muscular arms suggested he'd been a powerful man once. His eyes were clouded with the distinctive milky white of complete blindness, but his head turned toward them as they entered, tracking their movement by sound alone. More volunteers? Carlton's voice was rough, challenging. Let me guess. Young Marines sent here to do penance for something stupid. Marcus stopped dead, stunned by the accuracy of that assessment. Beside him, Jake actually laughed, a short, surprised bark of sound. How did you know, sir? Jake asked. Carlton's face cracked into a grin that transformed his entire demeanor. Because General Blackwood only sends people here for two reasons: genuine volunteers who actually care, or knuckleheads who need an attitude adjustment. And genuine volunteers don't usually come in groups of 3 looking like they're heading to their own executions. So which was it? Disrespect? Arrogance? Little bit of both? Both, Marcus admitted, figuring honesty was the only option with this man. We mocked an elderly veteran's dog tags at the commissary. Turned out he was a Medal of Honor recipient from Korea. Carlton whistled low. Well, at least you screwed up spectacularly. If you're going to be stupid, might as well go big. Have a seat and tell me the whole story. And don't leave out the embarrassing parts. Those are always the best. Despite everything, Marcus found himself smiling. Maybe this assignment wouldn't just be punishment. Maybe, just maybe, it would be something more. 3 months had passed since that Saturday at the commissary, and Marcus found himself back in the Memorial Garden at Camp Pendleton. But this time, everything was different. He wasn't here because he'd been ordered. He was here because he'd promised. The California sun hung low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the bronze plaques that lined the walkway. Marcus had memorized every name on those plaques during his Saturday visits to the hospital, not because anyone told him to, but because each name represented a story, a life, a sacrifice that deserved to be remembered. His phone buzzed in his pocket. A text from Jake, 5 minutes out. Devon's with me. They'd continued volunteering at the VA hospital long after their mandatory 3 Saturdays ended. Thomas Reed had passed away 6 weeks ago, peacefully in his sleep, and all 3 of them had attended his funeral. There were only a handful of people there, a distant niece, a couple of neighbors, and 3 Marines who'd learned what service really meant from a 94-year-old medic who still mourned a kid from Boston. Carlton Price had become something of a mentor to them. Despite his blindness and health issues, the man possessed a razor-sharp wit and an uncanny ability to cut through nonsense. He'd been the one to suggest they track down Hank Dalton again, to show him what his grace had meant. You boys learned something, Carlton had said during their last visit. Don't let that lesson sit in your head gathering dust. Put it into action. Find that Medal of Honor recipient and show him his forgiveness wasn't wasted. So Marcus had made some calls, pulled some strings, and finally got Hank's phone number from a sympathetic administrator. The conversation had been awkward at first, Marcus stumbling over his words, trying to explain why he was calling. But Hank's gentle voice on the other end of the line had put him at ease. I'd like that, Hank had said simply. How about the Memorial Garden? That's where we had our first real conversation. Jake's truck pulled into the parking lot, and Marcus watched as his friends climbed out. They'd all changed in subtle ways over the past 3 months. Jake had stopped making quick judgments about people. Devon had started visiting his own grandfather more regularly, actually listening to the old man's stories instead of just nodding politely. And Marcus had learned that being a Marine meant more than physical strength or combat skills. It meant carrying forward the legacy of those who came before, with humility and respect. "Is he here yet?" Devon asked as they approached. "Not yet." "Should be right on time, as always." They turned to see Hank shuffling toward them, his daughter Sarah supporting his arm. She was a woman in her late 50s with kind eyes that reminded Marcus of her father's. Hank looked frailer than he had 3 months ago, the weight of his years more apparent, but those rusty dog tags still hung around his neck outside his flannel shirt. "Mr. Dalton," Marcus said, stepping forward. "Thank you for coming." "Wouldn't miss it," Hank replied, his voice a bit more raspy than Marcus remembered. "Sarah here was curious to meet the young Marines who've been calling her father every week to check on him." Sarah smiled warmly. "Dad told me what happened at the commissary, and what happened after. I'm glad he had the chance to teach you boys something." "He taught us everything," Jake said quietly. They guided Hank to the same concrete bench where he'd told them his story 3 months ago. Sarah helped him settle, then stepped back to give them space, though she remained close enough to intervene if needed. Marcus had rehearsed this moment a dozen times, but now that it was here, the words felt inadequate. He pulled an envelope from his jacket pocket, his hands steadier than they'd been that day in the commissary. "Mr. Dalton, we wanted to give you something. It's not much, and it doesn't begin to repay what you've given us, but..." He opened the envelope and pulled out 3 photographs. The first showed Marcus, Jake, and Devon standing with Thomas Reed in his hospital room, the old medic smiling broadly. The second captured Carlton Price in his wheelchair, his blind eyes aimed at the camera, one arm around Devon's shoulders. The third was a group photo of all the veterans they'd met over the past 3 months. 15 men and women, different wars, different stories, all of them alive in that moment. "We've been volunteering at the VA hospital," Marcus explained, his voice thick with emotion. "Every Saturday, sometimes during the week too. We've listened to their stories, learned their names, and tried to give them the respect and attention they deserve. And it all started because you showed us grace when we didn't deserve it." Hank took the photographs with trembling hands, studying each one carefully. His eyes grew moist as he moved from image to image. "Thomas Reed," he murmured, touching the first photo. "I knew Tommy. We were at the VA together years ago in different ward. Good man. He told terrible jokes." "The worst," Jake agreed with a sad smile. "He told us one about a 3-legged dog that I still don't understand the punchline to. That sounds like Tommy." Hank looked up at them, tears tracking down his weathered cheeks now. "You boys have no idea what this means. So many veterans die alone, forgotten. The fact that Tommy had you there at the end..." He couldn't finish the sentence, emotion overwhelming him. Sarah moved closer, placing a hand on her father's shoulder. Devon knelt beside the bench, his voice steady, despite the emotion Marcus could see in his friend's eyes. "Sir, we also wanted to tell you that we've started a program at Camp Pendleton. With General Blackwood's approval, we're organizing monthly visits to the VA hospital for new Marines. We're calling it the Dalton Initiative." Hank's head snapped up. "The what?" "The Dalton Initiative," Marcus repeated. "We present your story, with your permission, to incoming Marines. We tell them what we learned from you, about respect, about service, about remembering that every veteran has a story worth hearing. Then we take them to the VA hospital so they can learn firsthand. General Blackwood has already approved it as an official program," Jake added. "Starting next month, every Marine who goes through leadership training at Pendleton will participate. That's over 500 Marines a year who'll hear your story and visit those veterans." Hank stared at them, speechless. His mouth opened and closed several times, but no words came out. Finally he managed, "You're doing this because of me, because of what you taught us," Marcus corrected gently. "You showed us that being a Marine isn't just about being tough or skilled or brave in combat. It's about honoring those who came before us, about carrying their stories forward, about never forgetting the price that was paid for us to wear this uniform. Sarah was crying now too, her hand still on her father's shoulder. "Dad, this is wonderful." Hank pulled his dog tags out, holding them up to catch the fading sunlight. The rust was just as prominent as it had been 3 months ago, the metal just as corroded and weathered. But Marcus saw them differently now. Those weren't damaged tags, they were sacred relics, baptized in blood and sacrifice. Carrying the weight of 28 brothers who never came home from a frozen hilltop in Korea, I wore these tags for 73 years, Hank said softly. Through the best days of my life and the worst. They've been with me through everything. Getting married, raising Sarah, burying my wife, watching my grandchildren grow. And not a day has gone by that I haven't thought about the men who didn't get to do those things. The men who died on that hill so I could live. He looked at each of them in turn. If this program helps even one Marine understand what service really means, if it helps one veteran feel remembered and valued, then those 28 men didn't die for nothing. Their sacrifice continues to mean something. And that's all I ever wanted. The old man struggled to his feet, waving off assistance, and Marcus, Jake, and Devon immediately stood as well. Hank came to attention, slower than he once would have, less steady, but unmistakably the posture of a Marine who'd never truly stopped serving, and he saluted them. 3 young Marines who'd mocked him 3 months ago, who'd judged him without knowing his story, who'd learned the hardest lesson of their military careers from his grace and forgiveness. They returned the salute sharply, holding it as the sun dipped below the horizon and the memorial garden was bathed in the golden light of evening. When they finally dropped their salutes, Hank smiled, a genuine peaceful smile that transformed his entire face. "Thank you, boys. You've given an old man something precious. You've given meaning to memories that have haunted me for 7 decades. Tommy and Carlton and all those other veterans, they're lucky to have you." "We're the lucky ones, sir," Marcus said. "We're the ones who got a second chance." As they walked Hank and Sarah back to their car, Marcus noticed something he'd missed before. Other people in the parking lot, Marines, civilians, families, were stopping to watch. Some of them recognized Hank, or perhaps they simply recognized what was happening, a passing of the torch from one generation to the next. A living connection between past and present. An elderly couple approached slowly, the man wearing a Vietnam veteran's cap. He stopped a respectful distance away and came to attention, saluting Hank. "Thank you for your service, sir. And thank you, Marines, for what you're doing." More people joined them, a small crowd forming spontaneously, all of them wanting to pay respect to the old veteran with rusty dog tags and the 3 Marines who'd learned to see beyond appearances. Hank accepted their gratitude with the same humble grace he'd shown in the commissary, uncomfortable with the attention, but understanding its importance. This was what Carlton Price had meant about putting lessons into action. This was how change happened, one story at a time, one connection at a time, one moment of respect given to those who'd earned it. As Hank's car pulled away, Sarah waving from the driver's seat, Marcus stood with his friends in that memorial garden and felt something shift inside him. He joined the Marines to be strong, to be capable, to serve his country. But today, he understood that true strength wasn't about physical power or combat skills. True strength was the courage to admit when you were wrong, the humility to learn from those who'd gone before, and the commitment to carry their stories forward so they'd never be forgotten. The rusty dog tags had taught him that, and he'd spend the rest of his life making sure others learned it too. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.